Ada for telling my dad he's as big as deadbeat as his stepkid's father. My parents divorced when I was 8 years old, and at first, it felt like the world had shifted but not crumbled. The arrangement seemed fair. My siblings and I, my brothers, aged 10 and 12 at the time, and me, the youngest, shared equal custody with our parents. Life was split neatly in two, yet it remained manageable. We shuffled between two homes, and despite the occasional hiccup, things worked well enough. For 4 years, our father seemed committed, present, and involved. He was there for the big moments, the little victories, and the everyday rhythm of our lives. It wasn't perfect, but it worked until everything changed. The catalyst for the unraveling of our relationship with him arrived in the form of Kira. She was, by all outward appearances, charming, polished, and warm. She had 2 children of her own, Darren, who was my age, and Vicky, 2 years younger. Their presence initially seemed innocuous, even welcome. Our dad deserved happiness, we thought. If Kira brought that to his life, then surely she would become part of ours too. But the changes started subtly, like a faint tremor before the ground gives way. At first, it was small things. Dad began skipping minor events, weekend visits, casual outings, school recitals. We told ourselves it was nothing to worry about. Everyone gets busy, right? He still came to the important milestones and showed up when it mattered most. Or so we thought. Over time, the absences became more frequent, the reasons more opaque. Slowly but surely, it became clear that we were no longer his priority. The time that was once devoted to us was now absorbed by Kira and her children. They weren't intruding, they were replacing. The cracks in our bond widened with each slight, each absence, each moment he chose them over us. When my oldest brother's graduation came around, we believed there was no way Dad would miss it. It was a momentous occasion, a culmination of years of hard work and dedication. But when Vicky fell off her bike and broke her arm the day before, Dad's decision was swift and unyielding. She needs both of us, he said, as though the rest of his children didn't need him at all. My brother stood on that stage, wearing a cap and gown, scanning the crowd for a face that wasn't there. His disappointment was palpable, etched into his expression as he walked across the stage alone. The unraveling reached its peak last year when tragedy struck. Our uncle, Dad's brother, passed away suddenly. The news was a devastating blow, the kind that shakes a family to its core. Yet we found out about his death not through a phone call, not through Dad reaching out in his grief, but through social media posts. The realization that we had missed the funeral came only after our grandmother called my mom, confused and hurt, to ask why none of us were there. It wasn't just an oversight, it was a betrayal. Dad hadn't even thought to tell us, let alone invite us to say goodbye to a man who had been a part of our lives. That incident shattered what little remained of Dad's connection to his family. My brothers, who had clung to hope longer than I had, finally severed ties. They refused to speak to him, their silence a testament to the depth of their hurt. The weight of that day still hangs heavy in our family. It's a reminder of how far Dad has drifted, how fully he has embraced his new life at the expense of his old one. His relationship with his siblings, his parents, and his children all fractured beyond repair. What hurt the most wasn't just his absence or his neglect, it was the way he seemed to revel in his role as a stepfather. He wore it like a badge of honor, boasting to anyone who would listen about how he had rescued Darren and Vicky from their deadbeat dad, how he had filled the void in their lives. He played the hero in their story while abandoning his own. His words were hollow, his actions a bitter contradiction. We, his children, were no longer part of his narrative. We were the footnotes, forgotten in the margins. Now, there's something you have to know about my father, a trait that defines him in his current life as much as his absence defines his relationship with me and my siblings. He has an almost compulsive need to brag about how exceptional he is as a stepfather. He loves painting a picture of himself as the savior of Darren and Vicky, 2 children he claims to have rescued from the emotional wreckage left by their so-called deadbeat dad. It doesn't seem to matter that, in the process of embracing this role, he has reduced his time with me to a mere shadow of what it once was. The 50-50 custody arrangement that once allowed us to share halves of our lives now feels like a distant memory. If I'm lucky, I see him 2 weekends a month. Most of the time, it's less. And yet, the narrative he spins about his life is one of unwavering dedication not to me or my brothers, but to his new family. Last week, I found myself at a dinner I didn't want to attend, surrounded by people I didn't feel comfortable with. It was a celebration of a family friend's birthday, and I suspect my father's invitation to me had less to do with a desire for my company and more to do with maintaining appearances. I happened to be friends with the daughter of this family friend, and my presence likely served to reinforce the facade of a loving and inclusive family dynamic. It didn't take long for me to feel the familiar sting of being ignored. My father and his family barely acknowledged me, as though I were an afterthought in a room full of carefully curated priorities. Their interest in me only surfaced when someone else at the table asked me a question, and even then, their concern felt rehearsed, like actors delivering lines in a poorly staged play. The evening trudged on, and I did my best to endure the isolation that had become a hallmark of my interactions with them. But the breaking point came when my stepmother brought up Christmas. With the kind of radiant enthusiasm that only made my stomach churn, she began recounting their family trip to Disneyland. She described the joy on Darren and Vicky's faces as they experienced the magic of Disneyland for the first time, how they had laughed and marveled at the sights, how it had been a holiday to remember. My father, of course, couldn't resist adding to the story, his voice swelling with pride as he bragged about orchestrating such a wonderful experience for his family. It was my friend who, perhaps unknowingly, lit the match that would ignite the evening. She turned to me, smiling, and asked if I had enjoyed Disneyland. The question hung in the air, innocent and unassuming, but it hit me like a thunderclap. I felt my chest tighten, my throat burn, and the words spilled out before I could stop them. I wasn't invited, I said, my voice steady but laced with bitterness. Honestly, I didn't even know they went until I saw it on social media. That's how I find out about most of their family trips. The table fell silent, the weight of my words sinking into the stunned expressions of everyone around me. My father and stepmother quickly scrambled to defend themselves, launching into a chorus of excuses. They spoke over each other, their voices rising in a desperate attempt to explain away my exclusion. But I wasn't interested in their justifications. I raised my voice, cutting through their noise like a blade. Yet, my dad loves to brag about treating someone else's kids so well while neglecting his own, I said, each word sharper than the last. By the way, Dad, when was the last time you even spoke to one of your sons? The color drained from my father's face, and for a moment, he was silent. But then he asked me, his voice tight with anger, what I was trying to say. The dam of my restraint broke, and the words poured out in a flood of pent-up resentment. You're just as much of a deadbeat as your stepkid's dad, I said, my voice trembling with emotion. At least he's an addict, he has some kind of excuse. But you? You threw away your own kids just to play super simp for a wife who's a bitch and her kids. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, crackling with the tension they had unleashed. My stepmother's face twisted in rage, and she began yelling at me, her voice a shrill cacophony of accusations and insults. Her anger only fueled mine, and I turned to the rest of the table, my voice rising to meet hers. You all want to know what it's like? Living with her. I said, my eyes burning with tears I refused to shed. She treats us like we're unwanted pets whenever we're there, and her kids love rubbing it in our faces how Dad chose them over us. And guess what? They're right. He did. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief, anger, and embarrassment. My father, red-faced and visibly shaken, stood abruptly and announced that we would discuss this at home. But before he could make his exit, my friend's mom intervened. She spoke firmly, her words cutting through the commotion like a knife. She didn't feel comfortable with me going anywhere with them, she said, and insisted on taking me home to my mother. My father tried to argue, his voice tinged with desperation, but my friend's dad stepped in, his calm authority silencing the room. Defeated, my father left with his family trailing behind him, their heads bowed in shame. When I arrived home, my mother listened as I recounted every detail of the evening, her expression a mix of anger and vindication. Later that night, my stepmother showed up at our door, demanding that I make things right. She claimed that my father had been locked in his office, crying ever since the dinner, and that her family was being harassed because of what I had said. My mother, unshaken by her theatrics, responded with the kind of finality that only she could deliver. "Tell it to the judge," she said, before slamming the door in her face. My friend's mom, ever the composed and level-headed figure, stepped in to defuse the tension. She turned to my stepmother, her voice calm yet firm, and told her to calm down. It was a simple statement, but it carried a weight that only someone with years of experience in handling chaos could wield. The effect on my stepmother was immediate and visceral. Her face flushed a deep, angry red, the kind of red that spoke of embarrassment, fury, and the realization that she had lost control of the situation. She glared at my friend's mom, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she were holding back an outburst that would only make things worse. That moment, when all eyes were on my stepmother, gave me the opening I needed to say what had been festering inside me for years. "Since we're airing things out," I began, my voice cutting through the strained silence, "let's talk about how my stepmom treats us when we're at their house. Like unwanted pets. Like we're some obligation she has to tolerate because she married our dad. And you know what? Her kids Darren and Vicky, they love it. They love rubbing it in our faces, smirking every chance they get, reminding us that dad chose them." The words poured out of me like a dam breaking, and I could see the shock ripple through the room. My father's face was a mask of discomfort and anger, his lips moving as though he wanted to interrupt but couldn't find the words. My stepmother's embarrassment deepened, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Darren and Vicky avoided eye contact, their smug expressions replaced by something that looked suspiciously like shame. For once, they didn't have the upper hand, and the realization seemed to hit them hard. My father, unable to sit through the humiliation any longer, pushed his chair back and stood up abruptly. The scrape of the chair against the floor seemed louder than it should have been, and all eyes turned to him. "We'll talk about this when we get home," he said, his voice strained and tight, as though he were barely holding himself together. He motioned for me to follow him, but my friend's mom interjected before I could even consider moving. "I'm sorry, but I don't feel comfortable letting her go with you right now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll take her home to her mother. And I'll be sure to fill her in on everything that's happened tonight." My father's expression shifted from anger to desperation. "Please," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "She's my daughter. We can work this out as a family." But before he could say more, my friend's dad, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped forward. His presence was steady and commanding, and his words were calm but firm. "I think it's best if you leave," he said, looking my father squarely in the eye. "She's upset, and this isn't the time or place to sort this out." My father hesitated, torn between his pride and the reality of the situation. Finally, with a defeated sigh, he nodded. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He turned to leave, his movements stiff and mechanical, as though he were on the verge of breaking down. My stepmother and step-siblings, who had been silent throughout the exchange, hurried after him. They didn't say a word, their embarrassment palpable as they made their way to the car. The weight of my accusations hung heavy over them, and for once, they had no smug retorts, no dismissive glances. Just silence. As they drove away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The tension that had been building throughout the evening was finally starting to dissipate, but the emotional toll of everything I had said and done was beginning to set in. My friend's mom placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, her touch gentle but grounding. "Let's get you home," she said softly, and I nodded, too drained to respond. The ride home was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt necessary after such an emotionally charged evening. When we arrived, my friend's mom insisted on coming inside with me to talk to my mother. She wanted to make sure my side of the story was heard and that my mother understood the full scope of what had happened. As we sat in the living room, I recounted the events of the evening, my voice steady despite the knot of emotions tightening in my chest. My mother listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to anger to vindication as the story unfolded. Later that night, as I was beginning to process everything, the doorbell rang. My mother and I exchanged a look, and she went to answer it. Standing on the other side was my stepmother, her face a mixture of anger and desperation. She demanded that I make things right, claiming that my father had been locked in his office, crying, ever since the dinner. She spoke of the harassment they were facing, blaming me for the fallout. My mother, ever the protector, didn't let her get far. "Tell it to the judge," she said coldly, before slamming the door in her face. The sound of the door closing was like a final punctuation mark on the evening, a definitive end to the chaos. As I sat in the silence that followed, I couldn't help but wonder if I had gone too far. The guilt was there, gnawing at the edges of my relief. But so was the anger, the hurt, the years of neglect and dismissal that had finally boiled over. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my father, but for now, I was content to let the door stay closed both literally and metaphorically. In the days that followed the explosive dinner, the weight of what I had done hung over me like a storm cloud. My mother, ever supportive and fiercely protective, reassured me that I was justified in speaking out. She reminded me that years of neglect, disappointment, and outright dismissal had led to that breaking point. Still, the echoes of my father's pleading voice and my stepmother's furious accusations lingered in my mind, clawing at the edges of my resolve. My father began calling me incessantly, his name flashing on my phone screen at all hours. I ignored every single call. Each time, the phone buzzed with his name. A mixture of anger, sadness, and something deeper, something like grief tugged at me. I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't know what I would say if I did. His voice would either unleash a flood of rage I wasn't ready to confront again or open a well of sorrow I was struggling to suppress. It wasn't just him, though. The harassment came in waves, like an unrelenting tide. Family members from his side, some of whom I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly took it upon themselves to weigh in on the matter. My inbox filled with messages ranging from half-hearted pleas to vitriolic accusations. Some called me ungrateful, claiming I didn't understand the sacrifices my father had made for me. Others accused me of being vindictive, of trying to ruin my father's life out of spite. A few, the ones who still harbored their own grievances against him, quietly expressed their support but distanced themselves from the drama. Then there was my stepmother. She showed up at our house one evening, unannounced and uninvited. Her face was a mask of barely restrained fury, and the tension in her posture made it clear that she had come to make demands, not to apologize. She didn't bother with pleasantries. The moment my mother opened the door, she launched into a tirade about how my actions had devastated my father. According to her, he had locked himself in his office since the night of the dinner, refusing to come out except for the bare necessities. She painted a picture of a broken man, undone by his own daughter's words, and demanded that I make it right. Her words burned, but not with guilt, at least, not entirely. They burned with the indignation of someone who had spent years watching my father ignore me while he played hero for someone else's children. My mother, who had remained silent through most of my stepmother's outburst, finally spoke with the kind of calm fury that only she could muster. "Tell it to the judge," she said, her voice cold and final, before slamming the door in her face. The sound of the door closing reverberated through the house, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. My mother turned to me, her expression softening. "You don't owe them anything," she said firmly. Not after what they've put you through. Despite her reassurances, doubt crept in. Social reputation mattered in our community. My father's tears, his retreat into isolation, and the backlash from his side of the family all fed into the narrative that I was the one who had crossed a line. I began to question myself. Had I gone too far? Had I allowed my anger to overshadow my sense of compassion? But then, I thought about the years that had led up to that moment, the birthdays missed, the milestones ignored, the funerals we weren't even told about. I thought about the way he had praised himself for being a great stepfather while failing to be a present father. And I thought about how it had felt to sit at that dinner table, surrounded by people who pretended to care about me only when it was convenient. The storm of emotions within me began to settle, and clarity emerged from the chaos. No, I hadn't gone too far. I had spoken a truth that needed to be heard, no matter how uncomfortable it made others. My father's tears weren't a reflection of my cruelty, they were the result of years of choices he had made, choices that had finally caught up with him. As the days turned into weeks, the calls from my father grew less frequent, though they didn't stop entirely. The messages from his family began to dwindle as well, their initial outrage giving way to the realization that I wasn't going to engage. My mother continued to stand by me, her unwavering support a constant reminder that I wasn't alone in this. My brothers, who had cut ties with our father long before I had, reached out to express their pride in me. "You said what needed to be said," my oldest brother told me during one of our conversations. "We've been waiting for him to hear it for years." Their words bolstered my resolve. I began to understand that standing up for myself wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was an act of self-preservation. I wasn't just fighting against my father's neglect, I was reclaiming my own voice, my own worth. In time, the storm began to fade. My father remained a distant figure, his attempts to reach out sporadic and half-hearted. My stepmother and her children faded back into the background, their smug superiority replaced by a quiet awkwardness whenever our paths crossed. Life went on, and so did I. Looking back, I know I could have handled the situation differently. I could have been more measured, more tactful. But in that moment, surrounded by the weight of years of neglect and resentment, I did what I felt was necessary. And while I sometimes wish things hadn't come to such a dramatic head, I don't regret standing up for myself. My father's choices shaped the person I am today, both the good and the bad. They taught me the importance of valuing myself, of not settling for less than I deserve. And while the scars of our fractured relationship will always remain, they serve as a reminder of my strength, my resilience, and my ability to rise above the pain. In the end, I realized that my worth isn't defined by his approval or his attention. It's defined by how I choose to move forward, to heal, and to grow. And for that, I am grateful.